It is a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome our keynote speaker tonight, Professor Ursula Heise. And while I know that for most of you in the audience, it is basically unnecessary to introduce her because you know her work so well, I will still read her bio just in case there is anybody here who does not know all of her accomplishments. So Professor Ursula Heise is chair of the Department of English at UCLA. She holds the Marcia H. Howard Term Chair in Literary Studies and serves as interim director of the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies, LENS, at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She's a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow and former president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. Her research and teaching focus on contemporary literature and the environmental humanities, environmental literature, arts, and cultures in the Americas, Western Europe, and Japan, literature and science, science fiction, and narrative theory. Her books include Chronoschisms, Time, Narrative, and Postmodernism, that's 1997, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, 2008, After Nature, Species Extinction and Modern Culture, 2010, and Imagining Extinction, The Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, 2016, which won the 2017 Book Prize of the British Society for Literature and Science. She is the editor of the series Natures, Cultures, and the Environment with Palgrave, and co-editor of the series Literature and Contemporary Thought with Routledge. She is co-editor of the Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities, 2017, and managing editor of Futures of Comparative Literature, the ACLA report on the state of the discipline. She's also the producer and writer of Urban Arc Los Angeles, a documentary created as a collaboration of Lens with the public television station KCET Link. She will be talking today about environmental futures and the agency of trees. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Ursula K. Heise. And hold your questions until the end. You will be later able to ask them either via chat or by raising your hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justina, and thank you, to Pavel, and to Julia for inviting me to this conference. Great pleasure to be here, and wonderful to have an opportunity to think more in depth about plants and literature, botany and literature, which is a topic that I've in the past thought about, but have not had an occasion to explore in great depth. So it's wonderful to make a start with all of you here today. Let me share with you what I'd like to do in my talk. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about some of the literary experiments that have been undertaken in the context of plants, especially trees, in connection with some of the most recent science about trees that has been built into some of these texts. And I would then like to speak more specifically about two aspects of this growing literature. One is the way in which trees open up a view toward the deep past and become a strategy for scaling up our understanding of temporality in the Anthropocene. And then on the other hand, how a different kind of take on trees as networks opens up visions of planetary futures. I'd like to begin with a short story, maybe a novella called L'Ami Silencieux, The Silent Friend, by the French fiction writer Bernard Werber from 2001. It's a cross-species mystery. Three charming jewelry robbers, Anaïs, Marie, Natasha, and Elisabeth, hide their luxury loot in the trunk of an old tree who calls himself and whom they call Georges. But Georges is not just a place, a background, a place to store belongings. He's a fictional character with an agency all of his own. He has an interior monologue throughout the story, and at the novella's climactic moment, he gathers all of his power of volition to drop one of his leaves intentionally at just the right moment to help the investigating police detective solve the mystery of the jewel heists. Now, Verbert is well known for his experiments with non-human characters in fiction, and often on a larger scale than in the story. His trilogy, Les Fourmis, Le Jour des Fourmis, and La Révolution des Fourmis, so the ants, the Day of the Ants, and the Revolution of the Ants, famously staged an urban ant population as protagonists, with humans cast in the role of their antagonists. Other books of his feature cats as major fictional actors. So he has gone very far in that direction, but of course, animal characters are not new in literature. They've featured in animal fables from antiquity to the 17th century, in works of modern literature, such as Kafka's Report to an Academy, and they play a central role in the genres of the comic book, the graphic novel, and the animated film. Plant characters, though, are much more rare, and they do not occur that often in Verbert's work. Much more so than animals, plants are associated with narrative settings, not with plots, with props, not with characters. But Verbert's Silent Friend is by no means the only or the most radical experiment in reconceiving narrative phytocentrically, so to speak. Ursula K. Le Guin, in her short story, Direction of the Road from 1973, already, I think, went one step further than Verbert by making the tree not just a character, but in fact, the first-person narrator. This tree sits by a footpath that over the centuries becomes a road and then a paved highway. And so the tree describes how the scenery around him changes and how the traffic becomes denser and speeds up. But it describes all of these changes as a result of its own actions. And the tree describes how it has to exert greater and greater force and expend more energy in making horses and carriages and finally cars larger and smaller as they approach or recede. So all of this from the point of view of the tree is what it does, not what somebody else does. So in this narrative, the tree is the narrator, but it also perceives itself as controlling time and space, not human agency. Now, Verbert and Le Guin are two of the writers who have most consistently upended the centrality of human intentions, emotions, and actions for narrative. Their narrative experiments resonate with a variety of strands of thought. First, of course, the environmentalist rethinking of human agency in the context of local and global ecosystems over the last 50 years, which Le Guin's work comes out of. The emergence of a variety of new materialisms since the 1990s, and the new field of human-animal studies, or critical animal studies, which questions binary human-animal boundaries and exceptionalist definitions of the human subject. Stories like L'Ami Silencieux and Direction of the Road also resonate with the even more recent field of critical plant studies, which has sought to extend some of the arguments of critical animal studies to plants. And the basic argument, I think, in some of this work is that if the boundaries between the categories of the human and the animal had to be historically established with great effort and have become newly fluid with scientific insights on the many overlaps between human and animal intelligence, science systems, tool usage, social structures, and cultural politics, the boundaries between animals and plants are equally uncertain, and perhaps even those between humans and plants. The cultural and literary study of plants is, I think, not yet well established, and that is, I think, the great achievement of a conference such as this one. And the names fluctuate a little bit. Some have suggested literary botany as a name for the field. Others have adopted critical plant studies, and John Ryan has suggested phytocriticism. Robert Polk Harrison's cultural historical work on the meanings of forests and gardens at different historical moments and in different cultural contexts, but mostly centered on Europe and North America, has been followed more recently by quite different types of studies. So you have Eduardo Cohn's How Forests Think, Toward an Anthropology Beyond the Human, or Susanna Hecht and her co-editors, The Social Lives of Forests, Past, Present, and Future of Woodlands, of Woodland Resurgence, and theories such as Eduardo Rivero de Castro's multinatural perspectivism. That is work that derives from Amazonian cosmologies that do not draw categorical distinctions between humans, other living beings, and spirits. The popularization of certain scientific approaches to plants, in particular trees, has contributed to this research from a different disciplinary perspective. The German forester Peter Wohlleben landed a bestseller with his 2015 book, Das geheime Leben der Bäume, was sie fühlen, wie sie kommunizieren, die Entdeckung einer verborgenen Welt, which was translated into English the year after it appeared as The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries from a Secret World. This is a book that's become enormously popular, as you probably know. It was not just translated into English, but into dozens of other languages as well. The discovery that trees chemically communicate threats to each other and react collectively to them, that a community of trees can sustain an otherwise dead tree trunk in a type of social agency has reverberated in the public spheres of many countries for years now. Like the gradual realization in European and North American public debates that conventional definitions of humans as the only animals with language use, tool use, or a complex social network can no longer be justified on scientific grounds, the discovery of sign systems and social networks among trees has begun to turn upside down Enlightenment relegations of plants to a world without an agency of their own. This reversal was anticipated in Le Guin's and Valbert's work, as well as that of other writers and filmmakers, and of course, in ancient myths and indigenous traditions of storytelling. It would not be too challenging to write a cultural history of plants in general, and trees in particular, as animated beings, and to explore their implications. That's not exactly my purpose here today. Instead, I would like to pursue what kind of temporality the new attention to the lives of trees and forests implies or might generate through their textual and image representations. The representation of trees, particularly their longevity, tends to foreground a special kind of temporality that decenters the human, and in the context of current environmental crises, focuses on the non-human components of what might help us sustain the world. And I will focus here on both what kind of past and what kind of future representations of arboreal temporality generate. And so to start first with images of the past, as you know, over the last 15 years, environmental storytelling and public discussions about nature have been crucially reshaped by essentially two ideas: climate change and the Anthropocene. Climate change has become the single inescapable fact about current changes in our global ecosystems that no serious environmental narrative can leave out. And the concept of the Anthropocene, proposed by two scientists in 2000, is often equated with climate change, even though it actually refers to a larger set of human transformations of global nature. These changes are so pervasive and will be so long-lasting, the ecologist Eugene Stormer and the atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen argued, that a future geologist will be able to detect the signs of human activity in the Earth's geological strata. So they proposed, we've entered a new geological era, no longer the Holocene, that's been with us for the last 12,000 years, but the Anthropocene. Considering they give a long catalog of what these human transformations of the global ecosphere are, and conclude by saying, considering these and many other major and still growing impacts of human activities on Earth and atmosphere, and at all, including global scales, it seems to us more than appropriate to emphasize the central role of mankind in geology and ecology by proposing to use the term Anthropocene for the current geological epoch. The impacts of current human activities will continue over long periods. Now, the main challenge that this idea of the Anthropocene raises for storytelling is its immense scale. The Anthropocene asks us to imagine ecological change at a planetary level, hundreds or even thousands of years into the past, and thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of years into the future. It also challenges us to envision the entire human species as an agent of ecological, meteorological, and geological transformations. Some researchers have seen this association between climate change and storytelling as a problem. The novelist Amitav Ghosh and the literary critics Adam Trexler and Timothy Clark have all questioned whether currently popular forms of narrative are able to address the spatial and temporal scales of climate change and the non-human forms of agency it involves. Modern story forms, they highlight, tend not to encompass these scales of space, time, and agency. They tend to focus on individuals, families, or nations, and not to exceed a human lifetime or perhaps a century, century and a half. So how do we tell stories at so large a scale? Now, I disagree with that anxiety. I think that literature and film are actually able just fine to deal with especially these large timescales. And I've shown in an article that came out 3 years ago that in English literary history, how speculative fiction in particular has actually always handled large time and space scales and non-human forms of agency as a matter of course in its narrative structure. Writers and filmmakers have also come up outside of the genre of speculative fiction with a number of other strategies to address this problem. For example, they link climate change or the Anthropocene to the life story of an individual, as Al Gore did in his 2006 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. Or they tell stories that include a wide variety of different characters and plot lines that add up to a global picture of nature and culture as both connected and heterogeneous, as Kim Stanley Robinson did in his science fiction novel, New York 2140, and also in a different way, his most recent book, The Ministry for the Future. Or they create cautionary tales about the present and future of nature. Barbara Kingsolver has done this in her beautiful novel about monarch butterflies and climate change, Flight Behavior. And Margaret Atwood and Paolo Bacigalupi in their portrayals of biologically transformed nature in their futuristic novels, Oryx and Crake and The Wind-Up Girl. There's also been a new interest among artists, photographers, film directors, and writers in how the plant world, and in particular trees, might open up a window for us into deep time histories and futures. The proposal of a new geological era, one that would be unprecedentedly short by geologists' usual standards, 500, 200, or maybe just 70 years so far, depending on when you set the starting point. And of course, there has been a lot of debate about when the Anthropocene begins. But that proposal is an invitation to rethink human history in relation to the history of the planet itself. And it's historians who have most eloquently discussed the challenges of this new kind of thinking. The post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty has formulated this, I think, most clearly. Environmental history, he says in his famous 2009 article, The Climate of History, environmental history, where it was not straightforwardly cultural, social, or economic history, looked upon human beings as biological agents. In unwittingly destroying the artificial but time-honored distinction between natural and human histories, climate scientists posit that the human being has become something much larger than he or she has always been. Humans now wield a geological force. To call humans geological agents is to scale up our imagination of the human. There's a paradox inherent in this scaling up and in the notion of the Anthropocene. On one hand, the Anthropocene, of course, emphasizes humans' awesome power as a species to transform their planetary environment. But that collective power often goes along with a deep sense of powerlessness on the part of the individual. And on the other hand, if you take seriously the invitation of the Anthropocene to think nature across intervals of deep time, the human impact might well seem quite negligible. So how do we do that? How do we scale up our imagination of the human so we get a better sense of our deep history and our long-term future? So one way in which photographers, artists, and writers have recently done this is through tree stories. Through the extreme age that trees can reach, centuries or even millennia, they can give people a visible and palpable window onto deep time. Now, that idea that trees give us access to deep history isn't new, of course. The conservationist Aldo Leopold, in his famous book, A Sand County Almanac from 1949, took several pages to describe the felling of an ancient oak. And he shows the saw gradually eating through layer after layer of history. We let the dead veteran oak season for a year in the sun it could no longer use. And then on a crisp winter's day, we laid a newly filed saw to its bastion base. Fragrant little chips of history spewed from the saw cut and accumulated on the snow before each kneeling sawyer. We sensed that these two piles of sawdust were something more than wood, that they were the integrated transect of a century, that our saw was biting its way stroke by stroke, decade by decade, into the chronology of a lifetime, written in concentric annual rings of good oak. Decade after decade, the saw goes back to 1920, to 1900, and finally to 1865, the oldest layer in this particular tree. So Leopold describes as he sees history open up at the moment that a tree has been killed. In a very different mode, but in pursuit of a similar concept, the filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock used this motif of the tree rings that lead the human observer back in time in his thriller Vertigo from 1958, so just about 10 years after Leopold. This film, as you may remember or not, many of us probably have not rewatched Hitchcock recently, it's a film about the way in which individuals are haunted by the past, not just their own, but also that of previous generations. And in a crucial scene, the detective character in the movie, played by James Stewart, takes a woman whom he believes to be an old school friend's wife to the Muir Woods in Northern California. The woman, played by Kim Novak, identifies obsessively with her great-grandmother, who lived and died in the 1800s. Here's that scene. Let me make sure that I have the sound shared. Yes, I have. Okay, great.
Oh, some 2,000 years or more.
The oldest living things.
Yes. You've never been here before?
No.
What do you think?
All the people who've been born and have died while the trees were not living.
Their true name is Sequoias hempivirans. Always green, ever living.
I don't like them.
Why?
Knowing I have to die.
Cross-section of one of the old trees that's been cut down.
Somewhere in here I was born. And there I died. It was only a moment for you. You took no notice.
So what's interesting about this scene is that on one hand, of course, in the plot, it stages the female protagonist's obsession with time past and her great-grandmother's role in the history of California over the last century and a half. But what's interesting about this scene is that the tree rings of the redwood go far beyond what is needed for the plot. The generational obsession with history on the part of the female protagonist only goes back to the 1800s, whereas the tree rings here take us back more than 1,000 years, far outside the time span of the plot. Momentarily, history flickers into view that is beyond human comprehension, a form of memory that encompasses the rise and decline of entire cultures. And again, as in Leopold, it is the transect of a dead tree that makes visible a history that the human imagination can otherwise barely grasp. The tree rings in their visual appearance offer humans the possibility of breaking out of our usual linear conception of history and to understand it through a different spatial metaphor. The concentric circles make different moments in time available simultaneously in a way that the typical arrow doesn't. So the imagination of trees as both a familiar part of our surroundings and profoundly different from us, together with the science of dendrochronology, has appeared in works of art and literature throughout the last century as a way of reimagining humans in relation to natural history. It's therefore perhaps no surprise that more recent artists and writers have returned to trees as a way of thinking about the Anthropocene. The writer and photographer Rachel Sussman, for example, in her book, The Oldest Living Things on Earth, in the world from 2014, focuses on organisms that have lived continuously for more than 2,000 years. Trees feature prominently in her attempt to grasp life histories that surpass human ones by many orders of magnitude. So on her cover is the image of a 9,000-year-old spruce tree in Sweden. One of her other images is of a 2,700-year-old cypress in Japan, and a tree in Florida that was felled at 3,500 years of age. She also includes bristlecone pines in the White Mountains that reach up to 5,000 years. And through these images, she invites us to think about forms of life for which time passes in an entirely different way than for humans. These organisms are living palimpsests. They contain myriad layers of their own histories within themselves, along with records of natural and human events. New chapters written over the old year after year, millennium after millennium, Sussman comments. But if the extreme longevity of trees and some other non-human organisms decenters human temporality and opens up a gateway to access time intervals that humans can't normally access, they've also come to be regarded as agents of their own in the Anthropocene. As I've already mentioned, the American science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin engaged with this idea well before the concept of the Anthropocene itself was proposed. In the most striking example, a short story called Vaster Than Empires and More Slow from 1971, a group of future humans travel on a scientific expedition to a new world without a name. It's called only World 4470. It turns out to be inhabited only by grass-like and tree-like organisms, nothing that looks or behaves like an animal. The scientists find themselves forced to question all the terms, cognitive, affective, and linguistics, by means of which they approach the planet. And they always have to ask as to whether they do not unduly project the terms of a totally different biological framework onto this new planet. One of the scientists highlights that dilemma when he refers to the tree-like plants of this planet as a totally alien environment for which the archetypal connotations of the word forest provide an inevitable metaphor. In this environment, humans are decentered by a plant world to which they are irrelevant. The survey team walked under the trees through the vast colonies of life, surrounded by a dreaming silence, a brooding calm that was half aware of them and wholly indifferent to them. There were no hours, distance was no matter. Had we but whirled enough and time, the planet turned between the sunlight and the great dark. Winds of winter and summer blew fine, pale pollen across the quiet seas. Le Guin here uses the longevity of trees and their completely different sense of time to upend one of the familiar motifs of science fiction, the encounter with alien. The title of her story and the sentence in this last quote, "Had we but whirled enough in time," allude to a poem by the 17th century British poet Andrew Marvell, To His Coy Mistress. It's a typical carpe diem poem. We'll be dead tomorrow, lady, so let's have sex today. We do not have whirled enough in time. But the trees do in Le Guin's story, and that's their profound alienness, but also how they're able to connect the humans to a depth of time that reaches far beyond what they're usually capable of. But having time enough is not the only thing that sets Le Guin's alien trees apart from the humanoids. They're not actually humans from Earth for the most part, or only a couple of them are, but they're human-like and human-related beings from across the galaxy. From the humanoids who wander among them, the explorers gradually discover that all the plants on this planet are connected in a network of alien sentients. And the sentience is initially, at least, deeply afraid of the presence of non-plant organisms where there never had been anything but its own planet-wide intelligence before. As one of the team's biologists points out, the entire planet's vegetation is a network of processes. There are no individual plants then, properly speaking. Even the pollen is part of the linkage, no doubt, a sort of wind-borne sentience connecting overseas. But it's not conceivable that all the biosphere of a planet should be one network of communications, sensitive, irrational, immortal, isolated. The scientists spend a long time in the story debating how to understand this planetary botanical sentience. As one of them argues, sentience or intelligence isn't a thing. You can't find it in or analyze it out from the cells of a brain. It's a function of the connected cells. It is, in a sense, the connection, the connectedness. Another sums up his experience of this utterly alien form of intelligence by characterizing it as sentience without senses, blind, deaf, nerveless, some moveless, some irritability, response to touch, response to sun, to light, to water, and chemicals in the earth around the roots. Nothing comprehensible to an animal mind. Presence without mind, awareness of being without object or subject, nirvana. So while longevity sets the vegetation of world 4470 apart from its human visitors, Le Guin here decenters the humans in an additional and ecosystemic way. She has them grapple with the idea of a planet-wide network botanical intelligence that resembles neither individual and human cognition nor collective social structures. The short story is no doubt Le Guin's response to Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which he proposed at around the same time in the late 60s and early 1970s. The idea that all of our planet's ecosystems should be understood as one coherent living whole. But rather than emphasizing humans' natural entanglements in this whole, or any idea of spontaneous harmony between humans and plants, Le Guin foregrounds the profound alienness of this biosphere, and at the end of the story, its profound indifference to humans. On Earth, we are surrounded by creatures whose sense of time and awareness is so different from ours, and whose way of life we understand so little, her story suggests, that it might as well be aliens from a distant planet. In a broad sense, of course, Le Guin's story anticipates, by several decades, scientific findings about earthly forests that have only been publicized in the last decade and a half. I've already alluded to Peter Wohleben's Secret Life of Trees that developed a profile of forests as communities of interconnected and communicating trees, where trees can signal the presence of dangerous fungi to each other and preventively mobilize defensive chemicals, for example, or where they can keep a dead tree stump alive for decades by way of underground rhizomes. In Le Guin and Wohleben, the attention shifts from the deep histories that the rings of dead trees reveal to the agency and communication of living trees, a momentous step in relativizing the centrality of human agency in narrative. Wohleben's theories have been widely discussed, and they're beginning to be taken up by performers and writers. In the aftermath, that is, not by way of anticipation as in Le Guin. The performance company Phantom Limb has mobilized the idea of tree rings as a way of accessing environmental history, along with casting trees as environmental agents. In their performance piece, Memory Rings from 2016, they develop a mosaic of moments in time of human and non-human actors as a reflection on deep history and climate change. Like some of Sussman's photos, this piece of performance and puppetry was inspired by a visit to the so-called Methuselah tree, a 4,787-year-old bristlecone in the White Mountains. In the performance, the ancient bristlecone functions as the narrative spine, the connecting link for animals and humans to different moments, some remote, some not, of human and natural history. I'm going to go out of my PowerPoint here to share with you just a 1-minute trailer that gives you a little bit of a sense of what that performance looked like when it was performed in New York and in California in 2016. So as you can tell from even this very, very brief impression of the performance, of which there are, unfortunately, to my knowledge, no complete recordings, the performance mixes humans, non-humans, and even objects as acting characters on the stage that work to co-create the natural and the social environment of the past and future. And you could see how, I mean, you can see the bristle cone, which is sort of the central spine of the performing narrative here. But also in the trailer, you see a woman sort of trying to hold down chairs made out of wood. So the wood, even when the tree has been killed and it has been transformed into an object, still has an animacy and aliveness of its own that humans are at pains to control. So it's a direct meditation on what shapes the natural and social worlds in the Anthropocene. But perhaps the most eloquent mobilization of trees as a narrative engine that allows us to imagine distant pasts and remote futures as a way of dealing with environmental crisis in the present is the well-known novelist Richard Powers's novel, The Overstory, which appeared in the spring of 2018. Powers has published over a dozen accomplished works of fiction since the 1980s, and quite a few of them engage deeply with the question of humans' relation to nature and with environmentalism. In this novel, Powers traces the stories of 9 different characters through the second half of the 20th century. Men and women, Americans with deep histories on the continent and children of recent immigrants, and characters of all different races and ethnicities. Each of them, at one moment or another of their lives, gets caught up in the protests against clear-cutting, deforestation, and more generally the degradation of nature that culminated in the real world with Julia Butterfly Hill's 2-year residence in a redwood tree from 1997 to 1999. She climbed the 180-foot redwood that later came to be called Luna to protest the logging around it and to protect the tree itself. And she only came down from the tree after she was able to negotiate a deal to save this tree and 3 acres of surrounding forest. And that, of course, turned her into something of an environmental legend. And she's still, often mentioned in accounts of environmental activism and its history today. Hill herself does not appear in Powers's novel, but several of the characters end up participating in very similar anti-logging protests, spiking logging equipment, chaining themselves to trees, and in some cases serving prison sentences as a consequence. But The Overstory is not just an environmental fiction based on real life events. It's also a book that engages deeply with the trees themselves, their ecologies, their long histories, and their sociality. One of the major characters, a botanist named Patricia Westerford, who is, I think, pretty transparently, a fictional replica of Peter Wohlleben, discovers that trees chemically communicate signals regarding insect infestations with each other, a communicative network that is modeled on Wohleben's and other botanists' research. And that, of course, resonates with Le Guin's portrayal of communicating trees on a distant planet. Westerford is ostracized from the scientific community and welcomed back only decades later when her research is confirmed by other scientific teams. Trees are agents in this novel, not just background or setting. Each of the characters is at one or more moments acted on by trees. Trees saved the life of a soldier in the Vietnam War, tear a woman out of her college life and make her drive to the West Coast to participate in the anti-logging protests. They stimulate several generations of nature photography and painting in another family. Trees like to toy with human thought, like boys toy with beetles, the narrator says at one of the characters thinks at one point. And this is, of course, for those of you who are specialists in English literature, it's a play on the old Shakespeare line from King Lear, as flies to wanton boys, so are we to the gods, we humans, that is. And here, the trees are the gods in the sense that they are the ultimate movers and shakers of the plot. There are connections to natural history, the novel suggests, that might allow us to grasp what climate change might entail. Echoes of Leopold's saw eating into tree rings, Le Guin's alien trees, and Sussman's oldest living things resonated all across the pages of The Overstory. One character counts rings on a dead tree trunk and marks time in an echo of Leopold. Westerford, the botanist, discovers a tree that may be one of the oldest organisms on the planet. She produces her loop from her keychain and applies it to one stump to estimate the number of rings. The oldest downed trees are about 80 years. She smiles at the number, so comical, for these 50,000 baby trees all around her have sprouted from a rhizome mass too old to date, even to the nearest 100 millennia. Underground, the 80-year-old trunks are 100,000 if they're a day. She wouldn't be surprised if this great joined single clonal creature that looks like a forest has been around for the better part of 1,000,000 years. That's why she has stopped to see one of the oldest, largest living things on Earth. That sounds like a page taken from Sussman's photography, and it articulates, of course, the same idea that what we see above ground may only be a part of a much older rhizome that is underground. Ultimately, in Powers's novel, the tree rings themselves turn into the prototype of the book and of narrative when one of his characters, who's now imprisoned for his anti-logging activism, just traces the wood grain in the desk in his cell. His fingers trace the grain in the desk's wooden top. He's trying to see how these wild loops in the wood could ever have come from so simple a thing as rings. The grain under his fingers swings in uneven bands, thick light, thin dark. It shocks him to realize, after a lifetime of looking at wood, he's staring at the seasons, the year's pendulum, the burst of spring and the unfolding of fall, the beat of a 2/4 song recorded here in a medium that the piece itself created. The grain wanders like ridges and ravines on a topo map, pale rush forward, darker holding back. He might decode the vast projects that the soil organized, the murderous freezes, the suffering and struggle, shortfalls and surpluses, the attacks repelled, the years of luxury, the storms outlived, the sum of all the threats and chances that came from every direction in every season this tree ever lived. He traces the grain and thinks of all the things this antique, illegible almanac could say, all the things that the remembering wood might tell him. So in this passage, the remembering wood ultimately turns into a book that is in theory, if not in practice, available to read, and becomes a double of Powers's novel itself that seeks to turn itself into a proxy for this wooden book. So the life of trees and narrative itself as a genre become intimately linked. The title of the novel, The Overstory, is a sort of pun in English. The word doesn't exist, but it's a transparent neologism that complements the word understory, which is the brush and low growth underneath trees. At the same time, it of course alludes to the big picture story that the Anthropocene was meant to convey when it was proposed in 2000. Except here, the story is approached from a different angle, making the humans the understory and the trees overstory. So it's the trees story that it really is the dominant one. Powers's novel ends with a network vision that in some ways builds on the networked stories that his narrative consists of. So he has these 9 different characters who are at the beginning unrelated, but certain connections gradually become visible between their lives as the novel moves on. At the end, the efforts by a virtual reality engineer, Nilay Mehta, to recreate the real world in all its biological and ecological detail converges with the monitoring of the real natural world by means of satellites in this vision. I think the novel remains skeptical to some degree of efforts to solve the degradation of the natural world through simulation, which is essentially what Mehta's efforts do. But it does develop a vision of global ecological stewardship that is in essence techno-utopian. The network Powers sees emerging in the future is not really the kind Le Guin described in her short story, even though there are resonances between them. Rather, it is a technologically engineered network, but one that allows plants to exert their agency and move at their speed, just as it allows humans to exert theirs. So digital technology, in other words, becomes a way of thinking human and non-human forms of agency together. So this is another novel that tries to decenter humans and put plants at the center, but ultimately is only able to reconcile the two through a particular vision of network technology. So stories like the ones that I've discussed here point the way to what a non-anthropocentric and more specifically a phytocentric type of narrative might look like. A narrative strategy toward envisioning what I have elsewhere called multi-species justice. Peter Wohlleben has argued in a different book than the one I mentioned earlier, that the future of our planet depends on the slow breathing of trees as they breathe in CO2 and exhale oxygen. And he calls that sort of a slow breath of trees as what will save our future. The chemical centrality of photosynthesis for the future of human life is now beginning to translate into these new forms of fiction and film and performance that seek to translate the breath of trees into narrative. Stories that might contribute to both human and non-human survival in present and future environmental crises. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. Yes, I can see people clapping, and I will clap as well. And I would like to slowly open the floor for questions. And first, let me, oh yes, and hearts and people clapping. Okay, now I hope that people will also be able to express their gratitude with their questions. Okay, so you can either ask questions by chat here on Zoom. I know that there are people watching us live on YouTube, and if you are one of those people, you can also ask questions via the YouTube chat, or you can simply raise your hand if you're on Zoom, and you can ask your question directly. So 3 ways, really, not either or, but 3 ways: Zoom chat, YouTube chat, or just raise your hand and engage in the conversation. So who would like to begin? Okay, because people are somewhat shy, or are we getting any questions on YouTube? Piotr is, no, not yet. Then I will begin, why not? I found your talk absolutely fascinating. I have also read the Overstory and I have enjoyed it. There is your main point. Well, there were so many main points, but one of them had to do with trees and being a representation, and I won't say a symbol, but a representation of the notion of deep history, and thus of us as humans having, at least in Hitchcock's Vertigo, experiencing this connection with history via trees in a very special way. But I'm sure that you know the concept of charismatic megafauna. This is a notion that I know from animal studies. I am an animal studies person, and I know that there is a correlate. This is charismatic megaflora that is beginning to be used in plant studies to talk about this special position in a way that trees hold in both our cultural imagination, but also this is used kind of critically to talk about the amount of effort in a way that's being put into research on trees, both in the life sciences and in the humanities, as in we're ignoring the small, ungainly, homely plants and talking about trees all the time. And I was thinking about this in relation to this notion of deep history, trees and deep history, as in to what extent does our attraction to trees and trees as representatives of deep history, or as a connection to deep history, to what extent is this actually anthropocentric? I mean, it is us as humans who see that deep history in trees. Would other species see trees as important for having that, for deep history? To give you an example of what I was thinking about, a literary example is, I was recently rereading Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, that book in which Steinbeck travels with his dog in a camper van across the US, and they reach Yosemite at a certain point in time. And Steinbeck lets Charlie out, and Steinbeck is just awed with the sequoias, the redwoods that he sees. And Charlie, the dog, basically just lifts his leg and kind of like pees on the tree, which Steinbeck sees as a kind of, well, funny event, but also as a kind of desecration, as Charlie's inability to kind of appreciate this deep connection. So I'm sorry for this question being so kind of multi-level or multi-layered, but I'm asking, I guess what I would like to know about is, isn't it overtly anthropocentric of us to be so keenly interested in, specifically in trees, as the kind of greatest, biggest, most fascinating representative of the plant world? That's it.
It is, and I don't think there's any way of getting around that, as there's no way of getting around the fact that, you know, the performances and films and images and texts that I've discussed here were created by humans. But I think there's two ways in which one can use that that term of anthropocentrism. I mean, on one hand, you can use it to simply dismiss any effort on the part of writers or artists to grasp or to empathize or to place humans inside an alien world and a world of other organisms and other biological communities. I've been sort of, and you know, on the grounds that an absolute non-anthropocentrism isn't even possible, and so maybe these attempts are meaningless. I don't believe that, and I don't believe it because of the arguments that the German philosopher Martin Gorki has made, that he said, look, to argue that our concern for other species, and he makes this argument in the context of a book on endangered species and the philosophy of human concern over endangered species in general. He's not just thinking of plants, but also of animals. He says, look, yes, you can dismiss any concern for nature as ultimately anthropocentric to the extent that the subject of the concern is still human. But he says to make the argument that that makes no difference would be tantamount to saying that there is no difference between egoism and altruism. That is, making that argument is itself, again, another form of egoism or anthropocentrism, in that you don't consider, you only consider what the source of the affect or the thought is. You don't consider what its consequence for other living organisms might be. And so the argument I think that I would make is that to the extent that that narratives that decenter humans and make us think about worlds that do not all revolve around humans have a positive impact on the worlds of those non-living organisms, they do have a really important role to play. That doesn't get around the argument that, of course, you know, everything is ultimately anthropocentric that we put our attention to. There's also another way, I think. So that's, I think, the basic underlying philosophical argument that, yes, sure, you know, I mean, anything that we produce or think is anthropocentric in the sense of coming from us and being structured by our interests. But that doesn't mean that all of what we think has the same consequences. And so in that respect, I think there are really important differences that have to be drawn. I would also make another argument. I mean, I get the point about the charismatic megaflora, and people have begun to actually push against that. I was contacted a couple of years ago by a writer for Bay Nature, which is a nature magazine up in the San Francisco area. And he was writing about some really inconspicuous kind of liverwort. I even forget the exact name of a really kind of not super attractive little plant. And he was, this was after I had published Imagining Extinction, and he was interested in, you know, how we could think about plants that are utterly non-charismatic, that have ugly sounding names even, and that most people don't really know about or care about if they do. So I think there, and his was a deliberate attempt to say we have to pay attention to those who are non-charismatic too. I completely agree with that argument. At the same time that, of course, we can't pay attention to everything, either as individuals or as organizations. So, so one way in which the emphasis on trees has come back and has been justified here in the American West is that, you know, in the current mega drought that we're living through, if we're going to put water into the plant world, we should put it into the things that are hardest to recreate once they die, and that is trees, because they take the longest. I mean, everything else, you know, flowering plants, shrubs, we can bring them back in a matter of months or years once the drought is over. Trees that die, forests that die off, it'll take decades, hundreds of years to bring any of them back. So it's precisely the longevity, again, that sort of becomes a crucial argument in, you know, allocating resources and attention to what we most need to preserve. Does that sort of make sense? So I think there is also sort of a more objective reason now that's emerged in a somewhat surprising way, I think, in the context of the drought, why trees are actually of particular importance to preserve.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. And of course, there's so much also work being done on non-charismatic megaflora as well. Mushrooms somehow have become such an important topic of research recently. So it's not just trees, but still.
But in very odd ways, right? I mean, I've actually, that's been a profound interest to me, how, you know, how sort of myco-criticism has become its whole own field. It is a bit odd to engage with that, especially Anat Singh's work, because she praises, you know, the Matsutake fascinations of Japan and other communities. And of course, you know, the ethnographic work is stellar that she does on sort of exploring the parallels between the Matsutake mushrooms as something that's been exported from Japan, has become a commodity, and then the migrant and immigrant populations that live off of it. At the same time, she seems fascinated and completely uncritical of ecosystems in Japan that have completely been transformed to allow for the growing of matsutake. So everything has been taken out except for the pine trees that the matsutake mushrooms need. So essentially in these ecosystems, there's 3 species: humans, pine trees, and matsutake mushrooms. From an environmentalist viewpoint, you might have real reservations about that kind of ecosystem as a model for anything we want to have in the future. So it's been odd, where I've really admired the ethnography, but I've not admired the ecological understanding of the matsutake industry.
It does. Oh, I do have a question, so I will not ask any more questions right now. I will hold my questions and responses to all the fascinating things that you've been saying and allow others to ask questions as well. I do have a question in the chat from Paweł Piszczatowski. Have you been concerned with what we can learn about the agency of trees by turning to the oral storytelling of indigenous peoples? We had today a fantastic paper about Australian Aboriginal relations to trees. Therefore, my question, also in the context of the need to create new biocentric narratives in the Anthropocene.
Yes. So my knowledge about that comes more from Latin America and from, you know, the important work that Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro have done on Amazonian cosmologies, and the idea that, I mean, to put it very simply, I mean, what Viveiros de Castro argues, of course, is that the way in which these particular cultures that he has studied, the way in which they categorize the world is exactly the opposite of European originating metaphysics. So he says, in these cultures, it is not nature that connects us and culture that differentiates us, meaning humans, from other species, but it is actually culture, by which he seems to mean a certain kind of experience of subjecthood that links us, and it's nature, i.e. the shape of our bodies, that distinguishes us. But in essence, he says, in these cosmovisions, a jaguar or an anaconda has exactly the same kind of subjecthood as a human being. It just has a different body. It's always been a little unclear to me there to what extent that also extends to animal species that are less central to these cosmologies, but it certainly also applies to plants. And of course, you know, indigenous cosmology, which are very different from each other, and we shouldn't all just, I think it would be very dangerous to just, you know, generalize very much about them, but there certainly are, there's that important, I think, line of thought coming out of Amazonian cosmology, out of Andean indigenous visions has come the idea of that, which is a combination really of modern legal thinking with indigenous cosmology, that Mother Earth and its parts, such as rivers or trees or mountains, should be attributed certain rights. So in the constitutions of Peru and Bolivia, this is anchored as a basic assumption about these nations. It's been hard to figure out exactly how to translate that into legal and policy practice. But these are ideas that do come out of indigenous visions of nature that do not categorize in the same way that Western philosophy does. So I do think that this is extremely, extremely important. And Ursula K. Le Guin, of course, is somebody who was very interested in that. I mean, in her novel, Always Coming Home, where she has a sort of, where she has a fictional indigenous people sort of re-inhabiting Northern California in the distant future. She was deeply influenced by those visions, and I think a lot of her stories with non-human characters at the center come actually out of that engagement. Now, I'm not an expert on indigenous traditions, so I can't sort of say that I'm an expert on this, and that's why I did not give a whole lot of space to these stories in this talk. But they're clearly, a source and one of the original forms of narrative in which the protagonists did not necessarily have to be human at all.
Thank you for the answer. I have another question from the YouTube chat right now. And the question comes from Judith Simon. Please, may you expand on the notion of the human as a meteorological agent? Meteorological agent.
I don't think I said meteorological, it's geological, that Chakrabarty proposes and many others have proposed. So the basic idea there is that, I mean, you could maybe expand it to meteorological in the sense of transforming the atmosphere. So the basic idea is this, that look, humans have always transformed nature, and from at least 10,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier, we have manipulated plants and animals and ecosystems to suit the needs of particular human communities. And with agriculture, of course, the breeding of animals and plants for particular food purposes has become a major engine of transformation of ecosystems globally. So in some sense, and some people make that argument that the Anthropocene is actually at least 10,000 years old, and that it's really no different from the Holocene in terms of how far back it reaches. Other people disagree, and they disagree on the grounds that they say, yes, humans have for many thousands of years been biological transformers, but they have not transformed the geology and the atmosphere in the way that we have for, well, take your pick, either the last 500 or the last 200 or the last 70 years, right? Depending on whether you set the beginning of the Anthropocene with colonization or with industrialization or with the so-called Great Acceleration after 1945. So the idea here is that now we're having an impact, and that's where the geology metaphor comes from, or I'm not sure to what extent it's a metaphor, but the idea that now with the use of radioactivity, with the massive extinction of species, with the deposits of microplastics everywhere in the earth and oceans, we are actually creating a geological stratum that will be distinct and recognizable for whatever future humans or post-humans will study geology at that time, right? So that there will be a distinct stratum that will have certain elements present and other elements like the remains of a lot of species no longer present that were there in earlier ages. So that's the geological idea. And then to the extent that you want to extend that to humans being a meteorological agent, it would be that we now have the capacity and have indeed transformed the composition of gases in the atmosphere. And the argument there is that that too is different. That is not something that we've been able to do for 10,000 years. That's a matter of the last 200 years. I mean, that's the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the late 18th century, right? So that is what is normally meant by those terms.
And thank you very much again. And another question from the YouTube chat. This one is from Sarah Hoang. Thank you for your very inspiring talk. You mentioned the Vietnam War. How does the agency of trees perform in the narratives of the Vietnam War?
That is a super interesting question. So when we think of the Vietnam War as Europeans or as North Americans, the first image that leaps to mind is that of the ecological degradation wrought by defoliants, right? And I'm assuming that the person who's asking the question is thinking about that. I'm actually just finished editing a volume on environment and narrative in Vietnam with contributions by 14 different scholars, some of whom write about the Vietnam War. And one thing that emerged, and that also has emerged in earlier work by environmental historians on Vietnam, is that actually the history of ecological degradation of forests in Vietnam is a great deal older than the Vietnam War. I mean, the Vietnam War resonates most, which is, by the way, called the American War in Vietnam. So the images of the American War resonate with Europeans and North Americans in terms of the damage that the American military inflicted on the Vietnamese landscape. Historians such as Pamela McElwee at Rutgers University points out that that was actually not the main concern of forest managers in Vietnam once the war ended, that they were much more concerned about a long-term history of deforestation and degradation of the forests that reaches deep back into the history of French colonialism. So the French already, logged forests, changed the complex hydrology of a lot of Vietnamese forests, especially in the South, long before any Americans came on the scene. And the socialist government that came to power after the American War, and to some extent continued, of course, these modernizing and industrializing projects. And all of these had pretty devastating effects on Vietnamese forests. So there's a long history of degradation of ecosystems in Vietnam, in which the American defoliation of certain areas, especially sort of in the middle of the country and then slightly to the south toward Ho Chi Minh City, is particularly prominent to us, but it isn't in a longer history of ecology in Vietnam. Now, you asked the more specific questions. What is the agency of trees in that context? It's an interesting question because that's where, Pavel's earlier idea about indigenous stories, or at any rate minority stories, comes in with a vengeance. I think, and clashing stories. So I think French colonials, American proxy warriors, and the socialist government after 1975 all reduced nature to a resource to be used. That has been the dominant narrative in Vietnam. And it has wreaked havoc on Vietnam. And in French colonialism, also I should add, ideas of European forestry were transferred to Vietnamese forests, whose composition of tree species and of woods and how they could be used are totally unlike Europe. So you have a story that's repeated itself in a lot of parts of the world, where ideas about forestry from Europe get transferred into ecosystems that are nothing like them. But anyway, so what historians argue now is that there's actually that the socialist government actually inherited, two sort of conjoint ideas of modernization, one derived from colonial ideas about progress and transforming forests to make them productive, and then sort of a socialist idea of nature as basically a resource for human progress, that has been extremely detrimental to Vietnamese forests for the most part, although the Vietnamese government from the 1980s onward also undertook massive afforestation efforts. Whether they were completely successful, I can go into that, but that might lead too far. In terms of counter narratives, one thing that has pushed against those is the narratives of ethnic minorities, especially in the Vietnamese highlands. So the Thai, the Hmong, the Khmer in the Mekong Delta. So different minority communities who have to varying degrees been oppressed by both French colonials and by the socialist government, and then been sought to recuperate at different moments, have, of course, very different ideas about the forest and have, sort of ideas about trees and forests being animated, containing both good and bad spirits that will sometimes support humans and sometimes harm humans. So yang and malai, so yang are good spirits, malai are bad spirits, for example. And they're considered, certain parts of them are, of course, considered sacred. And so those have been deployed as counter narratives, both for the maintenance of cultural tradition and to counteract government policies of forest management. The other strain that runs through this entire history, again, from French colonialism to socialism, is the resistance to Swidden agriculture or Swidden silviculture. So a lot of the minority communities in the forested highlands of Vietnam burn particular parts of the forest, then use them for agriculture for a while, and then let them lay fallow and move on somewhere else. And everybody from the French to certain American engineers to socialist government officials have blamed minority communities for forest degradation. And there's still, an ongoing debate of, the extent to which that kind of agriculture was sustainable, became unsustainable at a certain point with growing population numbers and so on and so forth. So I would say that in terms of narratives, it is through these ethnic minority narratives that the agency of trees has been brought most to the foreground. Whereas the dominant narratives have really sort of, adopted the typical traditional European attitude of looking at forests as, more than anything else, resources.
Thank you very much again. And I can see we have a question from the room, the Zoom room, our virtual room. Urte Stobbe is raising her hand. You can unmute yourself and just ask the question.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. Is it possible that I ask the question in German and you can answer in English? Is this possible?
Of course.
Yes, fine. Ich bin etwas müde und es fällt mir dann schwer, das auf Englisch zu formulieren. Vielen Dank. Ich bin sehr überzeugt von Ihrer Erklärung des Titels The Overstory. Also ich würde gerne über diesen Roman sprechen. Also Sie haben ja gesagt, dass sozusagen die Menschen die Understory, also die Untergeschichte sind und die Trees, also die Bäume, die Overstory sind. Und das würde ja auch zu Ihrer Idee passen, dass es halt insgesamt zurzeit um diese Vorstellung geht, Menschheit zu dezentralisieren, also die Bedeutung der Menschheit zurückzufahren. Ich hätte eine Frage, und das ist wirklich eine offene Frage, es interessiert mich, wie Sie den Roman gelesen haben. Würden Sie so weit gehen, dass dieser Roman sogar die Idee transportiert, dass das Überleben der Menschheit überhaupt gar nicht wichtig ist, sondern dass es die Bäume sind oder die Pflanzen sind, die uns sehr wahrscheinlich überleben werden, weil sie bisher immer Lösungen gefunden haben, zu überleben? Also da würde mich Ihre Lesart, Ihre Interpretation interessieren. Und die zweite Frage geht auch nochmal in die Richtung, Sie hatten ja im Beisatz gesagt, dass Richard Powers mehrere Romane im Bereich Environmentalism geschrieben hat. Hat er das, ich kenne mich nicht so gut aus in der US-amerikanischen Literatur. Shame on me, ich bin halt Germanistin. Deshalb wirklich die Wissensnachfrage.
Teilen wir Ihnen.
Danke. Deshalb die Wissensnachfrage, also ich bin da wirklich unwissend, hat Richard Powers schon einmal ein anderes Buch über Bäume geschrieben oder kann man vielleicht auch sagen, dass dieser Roman eine Reaktion oder in Wechselwirkung steht zu den aktuellen Diskussionen, wie wir sozusagen neu über Bäume und Pflanzen denken? Also das ist sozusagen immer meine These, dass ich sage, dass es da so ein also dass das interagiert, welche Literatur zurzeit geschrieben wird und wie wir darüber diskutieren. Deshalb die Frage an Sie als Expertin, würden Sie da mitgehen oder würden Sie sagen, nee, also Sie haben ja schon Beispiele gebracht, dass es auch schon Literatur gibt, die bestimmte Ideen vorher formulieren, aber die Frage ist halt, ob Richard Powers sozusagen so bestimmte Versatzstücke der aktuellen Diskussionen sozusagen als Inspiration genutzt hat, diesen Roman zu schreiben.
Okay, thank you, Ota. So I'll translate the questions first. So it was two questions about Richard Powers, and correct me if I don't summarize correctly. So the first one was whether Powers' novel in the end suggests that the survival of humankind is not really that important, but that it's the survival of the dendritic world of trees that really matters over the long run. And the second question is about earlier novels on environmental issues that Powers has written and whether those also engaged with trees and whether he's using certain elements of the current debate about trees and tree communication that have inspired his novel. Let me maybe start with the second one. So Powers has written an enormous number of novels, and not all of them are at all concerned with environmental issues, though quite a few of them are more indirectly concerned with nature. I mean, he's written some books about genetics, for example, that you could well argue still have to do with nature in some indirect way. But when I said that he had written other environmental novels, I was thinking of novels such as Gain, which is really about toxic pollution of the environment. The Echo Maker, which is about animal migration, or involves in one part of its plot animal migration and species extinction. I'm also thinking of an older novel of his called Plowing the Dark from the 1990s, where he already played with the idea of creating virtual counterworlds that might open up new possibilities that sort of updated to more current technological facts, reappears toward the end of the Overstory and reappears in the whole storyline that involves Nilay Mehta, right? The sort of video game, virtual online world engineer who is handicapped and sort of plays with the idea of really doing natural restoration virtually, right? I mean, he plays with the idea that even if the whole world and the entire ecosphere were to disappear, it could come roaring back in the virtual world. I'm not sure at all. And in fact, I'm pretty convinced that Powers is not endorsing that idea. It's just one among several strands, and he seems very skeptical that would be the solution. But he does acknowledge the important role that digital technologies might play in the survival of the biological world into the future. The second question I find a little bit harder to answer. I think I find it harder to answer in terms of Powers himself, because he is very invested in his human characters, and I don't know that. And it seems to me that to the extent that the ending proposes a possible positive solution to the current vast scale degradation of ecosystems, it is through a sort of technologically mediated stewardship on the part of humans. Now, with important modifications or qualifications attached to the notion of stewardship here, that it's not just humans who are in control. But I think he does still hold on to that idea in some fashion. So I'm not completely sure that in his vision, humans are unimportant, but that, you know, I think what interests him most deeply is that sort of symbiosis and often unrecognized symbiosis between trees and humans. But I think you're right, though, beyond powers, that this is a question about the attention to long time spans. And that's something that I really ran into in thinking about science fiction, which often does deal with enormous time spans. But it's true that in some of these visions, I mean, certainly humans such as we know them disappear. I mean, as early as the 1930s in something like Olaf Stapledon's Of Last and First Men, which is an amazing British science fiction novel that covers 2 billion years and 18 successive human, post-human, humanoid species, whatever you might want to call them. So, and that several times humans are practically wiped out and only a very small remnant remains. It's one example of a very strange novel, but one that that buys its vast depth of time with scenarios of near human extinction, and the idea that certainly humans in the shape in which we know them will not survive over any kind of length of time. So, and that is, I think, something that is a little bit underemphasized in some of the literary approaches to the Anthropocene. I mean, like Timothy Clark and Trexler and Gauche, you know, where they sort of bellyache over whether narratives such as we know them today and such as we like them today can actually encompass these long time spans. Yes, they can, but that's where the question of the human then really becomes tricky, because I don't think that they necessarily encompass human characters of the kind that we're used to, that we have to go back to, you know, maybe more epic structures that current readerships or viewerships might find slightly boring or slightly, you know, out of step. So I think that's where the question, where you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, most species have a lifespan of about 10 million years. That's not so much really in the overall development of, certainly not in geology, certainly not in evolution, right? 10 million years is a blip. So we're only about 200,000 years in though, so we have a good bit of time left there. So I'm not sure that powers really would endorse that vision, but it is a question that does come up when you emphasize longer time spans. Well, then, you know, the agency of humans is actually very, very minimal. And I mean, Lovelock in some of his later works, of course, emphasized that you know, that even in some of his articulations of the Gaia hypothesis, the planet is going to survive. Humans might not, if they continue futzing around with nuclear weapons, but the planet will survive, right? It's not a vision that sits very comfortably, I think, with most environmentalists, but it is one that definitely has come up in the context of these long time spans of the Anthropocene. Does that begin to answer it? But I'd also be curious to hear whether you do read powers as sort of wanting to say, yeah, maybe humankind is going to go extinct. I'm not sure that I see that, but I'd be interested to know whether you do.
Oh, well, no, thank you very much for your answer. It was, yes, I'm very pleased to hear your opinion. I'm really not sure about it. So it was a very open question to you, how you read it. And I thought that the figures, the protagonists, sometimes there are sentences in the novel that transport this idea, but it's not strong enough to just say powers wanted to say that. So your argument, I can follow your argument very much, very well. Sorry, my English is very bad at the moment. I'm sorry. Thank you.
And thank you for your answer as well. And I can see that I think I have no questions here in the room, no questions on YouTube. I wonder if I could maybe take advantage of my prerogative here as moderator to ask you a final question. Or are you tired and would you like to finish right now?
Not at all. It's 10:30 in California. I haven't had breakfast yet, so I'm wide awake.
Okay, it's 7:30 here. So
I know.
I'm hoping our participants can keep going, but I just wanted to ask you, a broader question, I would like to ask you to reflect on the theme of our conference, that is on this interest in plants in general that is coming from the humanities. And what I mean by that is, even though the environmental humanities have been around for a while, I mean, basically since what, the 1970s or so, the topic of plants in particular seems to be quite a new one, or this increased interest in plants, or a different kind of interest in plants. And I remember reading in, I think it was 2015 or 2016, Jeffrey Nealon's book, Plant Theory, when it came out. And this was a book that was written kind of tongue-in-cheek, as in plants are the limit case. Like, if you are doing animal studies now, then the next step would be plants. And 5 or 6 years have passed, and suddenly it turns out that Nealon's kind of ironic, comment about plants is reality, that so many scholars in the humanities are now interested in plants specifically. Can you reflect on this interest? Where do we come from? Where are we going?
Yeah, that is a super interesting question. So I do think that there is a long-running strand of interest in the life of plants and in the otherness of plants. And I'm thinking here of kind of a hippie book that came out in the 1960s, which was called The Secret Life of Plants, right? Where the theory was that you can sort of communicate with your potted plants in your apartment by playing certain kinds of music. And, I mean, it was not based on science at the time, but it was a very popular book in the sort of hippie and then new age circles of the 60s and 70s. And I think Le Guin's work from the 70s to some extent plays with that, even as she also is already aware of the degradation of forests and what is happening with that. So I don't think it's completely new. I would also signal another strand of preoccupation with plants that also came out of these sort of alternative social movements of the 1960s, which is the interest in hallucinogenic plants. And I mean, you see that in another sort of popular bestseller, Carlos Castaneda's The Yaqui Way of Knowledge, right, which was anthropologically speaking a complete fake. But it is still interesting to reread in terms of a critical eye on how indigeneity was constructed, but also the first person narrator, of course, does have plants speaking to him on his trips. So the idea that plants have agency and that this agency is opened up through these hallucinogenic chemicals that they impart to your body is not a new one. So that there are those strands of thought that I think do go back to the 1960s and that have been around. I think that obviously the progress in scientific discoveries about plants in general, trees in particular, are at some level, at the root of the current interest, just as new discoveries about the sociality and politics of animals and their tool usage, their sophisticated sign systems contributed to the rise of critical animal studies. So I think the scientific world is apart from the environmental humanities, but it's not. But it does reshape, what scholars in the humanities do. At the same time, I think that the sort of questioning of species boundaries and species notions, and of course, just even broad categorizations, supra-species categorizations like plants, animals, humans, fungi, that are all porous at the borders. I mean, these are all, there's all, everywhere you look, there's crossovers, and we know that these large cultural categories are useful in some ways and then completely misleading in other ways. And I think critical animal studies did a lot to open up that questioning and allowed us to look into critical plant studies. At the same time, that I'm also interested in seeing where the limits of this are, because I mean, you have it even reaching into the areas of inanimate nature, right? So Serenella Jovino and Opperman have written about, you know, the narratives of stones. Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has written about stones in the Middle Ages and onward, sort of where stones and rocks are sort of looked at as agents and as possessed with some kind of volition and agency and the capacity to tell stories. I have to say, I'm personally very skeptical of that turn, because it doesn't seem to me to be really leading anywhere super productive in terms of how we actually want to deal with environmental crises. But it's even been pushed beyond living organisms. So this is a very general tendency right now in environmental humanities that has come about through that questioning of boundaries. Where I see the limits of critical plant studies is this, that you know, out of human animal studies has come a huge movement of activism against current industrial agriculture, against the consumption of meat. So very strong movements that link their study of animals and their appreciation of animals with pretty radical changes in food production and food consumption. It's not clear to me that that can happen in the case of plants, right? Where are we going to go, and how, to what extent is the attribution of agency, volition, intelligence, communication to plants then become a difficulty in the face of the reality that we still have to consume plants, and we especially have to consume more plants if we're going to consume fewer animals, right? So I think it's going to be interesting to see in what ways exactly that is going to translate into actual political activism. And I think it's going to be harder. I think it's going to be a lot harder than in the case of critical animal studies. But I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that translation.
Would anybody like to speak up right now and comment on plant studies and its limits? No. It definitely does seem to be less politically engaged or less connected to a specific activist movement. You are correct there. But plant studies does have that connection to like the environmentalist movement in general. I think that is somehow there.
I mean, in some parts of the world, it is connected, like in Natari Wangai's activism is connected with a certain type of feminism, ecologically inflected feminism. In other parts of the world, it is connected to anti-war activism. And I mean, that came up a little bit earlier in the context of the war in Vietnam, right? So the mistreatment or the willful destruction of plant life, or efforts to recreate and reforest and restore plant life have been linked to these other kinds of movements, but those are still not necessarily movements that put plants front and center as something to be preserved in its own right. It's because that's good for the communities, right? In those contexts. So anyway, it's an interesting question.
Well, thank you very much for your reflections, and thank you very much for the wonderful talk, the lecture. I definitely enjoyed it, and I hope everybody in the audience did as well. Well, I'm sure you did. So thank you once more for joining us. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ursula. It was a great pleasure to have you among us today, and we stay in touch.
Definitely. We are looking forward to more meetings in the future, hopefully also in person.
Same here, yes, that would be lovely.
It has to be done.
Thank you very much, everyone. And this is the end of today's conference, Saturday. It is 7:30 here, so you can, well, wherever you are, you can go, yes, and just enjoy your evening or your morning if you are in California.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.